You have found the Thinking Mind podcast.
Dr. Sotiris, Posporelis, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Nice to meet you, Alex. Thanks for the invitation.
Just to frame this conversation a bit, obviously we're living in a strange time, which I think is only serving to get stranger. I find myself thinking about how, before this sort of pandemic situation hits, we're all kind of operating in our own micro universes. I was, for example, operating in psychiatry, as are you. And then this pandemic hits, and all of a sudden we're reminded that we have very much in common, not least the fact that we're all susceptible to infection. And now everyone's dealing with how their industry and how their problem, whatever their mission in life, relates to this pandemic. And so there's a lot to talk about. I know that you've now developed a webinar series, which initially started off as a response to how do we relate psychiatry to this pandemic, and how should we, as psychiatrists, adapt? And then how do we now, what's the situation going forward? Because I think even though we're out of perhaps the heat of the first wave, it seems that there are going to be some lasting difficulties which we're going to be grappling with for quite some time. So there's a lot to talk about. But first, I always like to hear about someone's path into psychiatry, because it's always so unique and interesting. And I know that you were a radio DJ in Greece once upon a time, and that's not a trajectory that you hear about often. So maybe you could take us through how it is that you came to from there to working in South London psychiatry.
Definitely my trajectory, you could say it's it's not typical for sure, and I wouldn't recommend to anyone to actually follow that trajectory, because the truth is that you don't know where it's gonna take you. But this is what's also nice about it. In a sense, it was a bit all over the place, reflecting as well the state of my brain at some points in my life. It's been, or you could say that attention and concentration, you could say that it's not my my best, let's say, strengths. But also, this lack of focus and, being carried away by the river of life, I really enjoyed it, I have to say. Yes, I could have done things in a better and more structured way, if you like. But I don't think, first of all, I don't regret, not even for a moment, because it allowed me to experience so many other things that otherwise I couldn't have. To put things into context, the music is my passion, and my music, I mean, listening to music. I also play music, but I'm really bad, so I won't go into that. But through collecting records and all that stuff, I ended up having so many records that I was like, why don't I DJ? Why don't I use it? I have more records than the DJs that go and play in the bars. And at the same time, I was, I just, finished high school, so some extra money, would come handy. So I started like that. And then, at the same time as I was studying medicine, I started DJing full time. And then I started doing radio. I had a number one radio show for a few years back home before I decided that that's too superficial. It's a completely different lifestyle. Don't get me wrong, I really, really bloody enjoyed it. But the truth is that I felt that something was lacking, like the sense, and again, don't take this the wrong way. Don't take this like people that are doing, entertainment things are less than doctors. No, not at all. But for me, at that moment in time, it lacked the sense of purpose, right? And I think this is really important. So I decided completely out of the blue, to just move countries. I'm not going to go into the details of how bad the system is in Greece. But so I just switched from having the number one radio show to move to London and pursue a career again in medicine, because for, I think, like nearly 3 years, I wasn't doing anything that was even remotely relevant to medicine. No, not that I wanted to, but, this is the situation in Greece. Yeah, so then, I came here, did my mostly training. In the meantime, between core training and higher training. I went to Johns Hopkins in the States to do some research. Ended up staying there again. This is my brain, the initial plan was to go for 2 to 4 months, and obviously it was impossible. So I ended up staying there 1.5 years. Loved it. Came back, did the higher training, and here I am now.
Mm-hmm. I often find that people who do end up in psychiatry have that more kind of almost tangential associative thinking style. Personally, I even remember in medical school having to literally adapt my brain to thinking from this very sort of scattershot manner to being forced to all of a sudden think in a very linear A to B to C kind of way. I'm finding it very uncomfortable. Obviously, it's very useful to think in that very medical, linear, systemic, textbook way. But I find that my personal thinking style, from what you said, and other psychiatrists I've met, were very much about that kind of more right hemisphere, sort of associative kind of thinking pattern. So now maybe you could talk about a little bit your current day-to-day job and what that involves.
Well, you mean pre-pandemic?
Pre-pandemic, and then maybe how things shifted.
Yeah, well, I'm a liaison neuropsychiatrist, which means that for people that are not familiar with with the term liaison, it means that I'm based in a general hospital. So I'm based in King's College Hospital, which is in southeast London. It's one of the 4 major trauma centers, so 950 beds. So you can imagine it can get busy and hectic. So I see patients on the wards that have any psychiatric symptom that's related and linked to urology, neurosurgery, electrophysiology, stroke teams, brain injury teams, trauma teams. So, really diverse, but always relevant to neurology. And that's, neuropsychiatry is this beautiful junction between neurology and psychiatry. Though, if you ask me, I think it would have been one specialty as it was, back in the day. But anyway, so this is, the main part, of my clinical reality. And then I have a national specialist clinic that, we see patients, we receive referrals from all around the country, and we see patients with neuropsychiatric needs. So this is, in a nutshell, obviously then, I do research and I do loads of teaching and all that, but this is on the side. But the clinical side is, what I described,
I've often found there's kind of an interesting split in neuropsychiatry, and I'd be curious to get to your thoughts on this, where on the one hand, obviously in neuropsychiatry, you see patients with very hardcore organic issues, brain trauma or brain damage from other means. And then on the other side, you have patients presenting with functional symptoms, or what we would call medically unexplained symptoms, where often we think that the root of these very physical symptoms is psychological. So on the one hand, you're approaching mental symptoms and mental disorders with a very biological lens. And on the other hand, you have patients where there's more of a psychosocial lens. Is that how you see it as well, or do you see it differently?
I see it differently, I'm afraid. So for me, there's no division. One of the things that I fight, on a daily basis, in the hospital, is trying to shift the understanding of how psychiatry is perceived and move away from this, arbitrary division between organic and non-organic. I think everything is organic, and by that, don't get me wrong, of course, the way you're brought up, where you live, how much money you make, everything, does affect you. But it doesn't affect the ether around you. It does affect you as a person. It does affect your brain. So unless we say that, the way you feel, think, and behave is based somewhere else and not in the brain, then everything is organic. Because even now, you're talking to me, you ask me a question, it went in my brain. So yes, it is organic. There's nothing non-organic about our brain. So I think it's arbitrary division. Now, yes, of course, as you said, we see a wide range of things. So we may see people, with brain injury, and at the same time, we may see people with functional neurological disorders. Now, there is this misconception that functional neurological disorders is always some hidden meaning, some psychological trauma or some actual trauma that people have experienced in their lives. And this is mostly based in, the slightly more old school theories, of Freud, basically. They talked first about, repression and conversion. And actually, for many years, functional neurological disorders were called conversion disorders. And I mean, if you were to go even, further back in time to my ancestors, it was called hysteria, right? Now, does this mean that everyone that has a functional neurological disorder, they also have psychological trauma? Definitely not. So you will be really disappointed if you wait, to get a really long psychiatric history and see that actually there's nothing there. There's nothing, at least nothing really big. So that the big things that people are expecting to hear. Yes, you are right that, people that have experienced trauma, they're predisposed. So they have higher chances of developing functioning, but not all of them. And there are definitely, loads and loads of studies that have approached this in a different way, using, more modern methods, thinking about, fMRIs, for example, that actually show there are parts of the brain that are activated, in a different way in people with functional neurological disorders, compared to people that don't have NFAD. So, it's not black and white, and it's certainly, way more complex than we think. I mean, the brain is, is beautiful and for the most part unexplained. And just to go back, just the last thing, because I know that I talk too much, but because you mentioned the word medically unexplained. I think that the majority of medicine is medically unexplained. We don't really have answers for even, really basic stuff. Yeah, unfortunately, sadly. Or maybe, it's up to a point, it's a good thing. It keeps us on our toes and we keep on researching things and trying to find answers. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's true that whenever sort of skeptics are discussing the state of psychiatry or psychiatric knowledge, it's often not acknowledged just how arbitrary certain medical treatments are and how little certain medical treatments are understood, and that yes, we're going by the evidence, but there's still a huge amount of mystery to our biology, especially our brain, as you mentioned. I suppose what I've been thinking more about lately is how, like you said, it's not this sort of organic versus inorganic divide is kind of too antiquated. It reminds me of the nature-nurture divide. It doesn't actually make sense.
No.
What it seems, at least to me, what it seems more about is what is the interaction. So what's the interaction between nature and nurture? For example, we know now that our DNA is subject to change from the environment. Our DNA will change simply by lifting weights or by eating different foods or by exposure to sunlight. And I think similarly with our brain and mental disorders, there's still a mysterious element to the biology. But rather than treating the biology and the psychology and the social separately, we should be asked, it's the wrong question. The question should be, how do these things interact with each other? How does trauma interact with your biology? And can there be biomarkers for that?
Yeah, I think, of course, the issue with that is how do you actually reflect that in a research paper, right? And this is, the difficulty. Sometimes in order to produce good research, good quality research, you need to have a really specific question. And making it so complex, obviously you make it more pragmatic, but of course, even way more prone to error or false, interpretations. But yes, you're right. It's too complex.
Yeah, I think even though we could, even on the level of a micro question, we could reframe the premise to hone in more on the boundaries between the different schools of thought rather than keep it within.
The thing is, and something that I feel that, is missing, and I've been banging on about that, for many years, is, that as a psychiatrist, I think that we need way more to come way closer to our colleagues in basic science. They do amazing stuff, amazing experiments that really progress our understanding of, of how the brain works. Now, What happens though is that there is a massive gap between us and them. And I saw that, when I was in Hopkins, people, would do amazing, experiments with mice and molecular stuff and blah, 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 blah. And then they would jump to some like really amazing conclusions, but taking a huge leap of faith in translating, let's say, I don't know, one protein to a delusion.
Right.
And the problem there was that they didn't really have a clear understanding of what a delusion is. And similarly, us, and I put myself in there as well, that we don't have a clear understanding of the other side. About the molecular stuff that you just mentioned. And I think that it's really important to bring those two together. It's going to significantly increase, the quality of research that goes out there. And, one of the great examples of that is, the clinical academics. So people that, choose this path and that can bring these two worlds together. And when I was in Hopkins, I started this educational series. Obviously it was called, really cheesily called Mind the Gap. Just moved from London, so yeah, I know, really cheesy.
I'll forgive you.
But it was, and it's still happening there. So it's part actually of the program to become a psychiatrist. When you're training to become a psychiatrist at Hopkins, you have this series. And what happens there is every time I was inviting a scientist to actually talk about the research, while clinicians were at the same time, let's say, challenging, but in a nice way, right? It was about, anyway, I'm not going to go into great detail, but it was really beautiful to see the misconceptions that are both sides. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, and it's also worth noting just how arbitrary the gaps between disciplines are. So there was a time, in the creation of universities where we made these, different departments, architecture, engineering, medicine, law. And now I think, particularly perhaps because of the internet, but maybe because of other reasons as well, I think people are starting to realize just how arbitrary these different sections of knowledge are. And, obviously, these are just constructs which we put on reality. We say this is biochemistry, whereas this is clinical psychiatry. But obviously, the reality is way more complicated than the models that we transpose on it. So obviously, if we're going to actually address these complex problems, we need to take this interdisciplinary approach.
But at the same time, I think that you need both. You cannot be an expert in something if you're not really focused on something, right? Mm-hmm. Doing basic science, you can run an experiment for 5 years, 10 years. So you need to be really focused and passionate about something and learn everything around that. But at the same time, you risk, losing the whole picture. And that's why I think it's really important to work as part of teams. So you need people that, they're passionate. This is it. This is a one-way street. And then you need the people that say, oh, no, look outside this box. There's so many beautiful things. Let's bring them in. And it's through this collaboration, I think, that, research can flourish. But
I have a question on that subject. I've spoken to a few academics now who, obviously they do operate in teams, and they often find that the academic environment simply isn't set up for collaborative work, actually. Even though people do have to work collaboratively, the incentive structure is based around, success via publishing as many papers as you can and getting your sort of first authorship or whatever it is. And what that sets up is actually a lot of individualistic thinking and operating within academia and within the peer review structure. In your experience, has that been a problem, do you think, towards a problem against kind of scientific progress? Would you have any suggestions or thoughts about how it could be done differently?
Man, it's money and fame. Money and fame is everything. Corrupts everything. And it corrupts, obviously, every part of life. And academia, obviously, couldn't be an exception to that. So you have big brains with big egos. And in order to progress the research, at some point, they need to be brutal. Not always, and I'm not saying that you have to be brutal and completely heartless, but sometimes this happens. Now, the problem is, I think, that there's not enough sharing of the love. And the sharing of the love, it means both financial love, but also intellectual love. People sometimes they get absorbed in this bloody quicksand of, I'm not sharing my ideas. Somebody's going to steal my ideas. They're going to do something with it. Well, to be honest, if someone if gets inspired by one of my ideas and have, the balls to go out and do that, well, well done. That's amazing. Now, the problem though starts when they completely ignore you, when they sidetrack you. It's like the same, obviously in a way, in a way smaller level, because I'm not a big academic or anything. If, let's say, for example, I need help with a small project in the hospital, and I want to do, let's say, a small paper, and do loads of teaching in medical school, and I say, to the medical student, oh, you want to come and help me? So they come and spend, hours, they do whatever they're doing, and then suddenly, magically, I become an author of a really nice paper, and where is the student? Nowhere to be found. And so that's bad. And this happens loads of times in research, and sadly, most of the times, it doesn't end up nicely for anyone. Mm-hmm. Anyway, it's a really big topic. I'm afraid that we can talk only for that, for many hours. But generally speaking, I think that money and fame has corrupted academia.
I think probably one takeaway is to not think that just because people are successful and gifted that they aren't prone to problems of the ego.
Yeah, but at the same time, I don't want people to think that, everyone's bad. No, there are amazing people that give like really beautiful opportunities to everyone. And when I say to everyone, I mean from clinicians to students to scientists. And so it doesn't mean that people that are high up that tread on dead bodies to get that high up. No, there are some of them. Some of them are like that, but not all of them. Yeah.
And of course, it's partly a problem of the way the system is set up in terms of incentive and reward, right? So at the moment, the system is set up to reward an individualistic drive. And I wonder, although like you said, this is a huge area, what could be done to promote a more collaborative framework, given that science is such a team-based effort and requires that sort of collaborative way of working. I wonder if you could tell me a bit about Braincast, your webinar series, and what's the goal of Braincast? How did it start?
There's no goal. That's the goal, and that's what I love about it. It all started actually. It was during the pandemic. So I'm so lucky. I have an amazing SPR, and I have also. There was another SPR that was redeployed, helping with general liaison team. So here, King's College Hospital. And they're both academics, and they came clinical academics. So these are exactly, the people that can progress, our understanding of the brain even further. That, they have, hands both in clinical stuff, but also in the researchy type stuff. So they came to me. So one is Jonathan Rogers, and the other one is Tom Pollack. And they came and said, "Oh man, we're thinking about doing a talk about, the pandemic." I think that around that time, Jonathan had a paper that was about to be submitted or was already accepted, but it wasn't published yet, something like that. And he was looking, interestingly enough, at the coronaviruses of the past, so the past outbreaks. And it's like, this is amazing, let's do it. But let's do it a bit differently. So let's do it, more informal, so that people that don't really know about psychiatry, that don't know about basic science and all that they can really benefit from that. I say, yeah, okay, let's do it. And so we set it up like that. I got in touch with Mostly Learning, pitched the idea. I was like, yeah, that sounds amazing. Yeah, let's do it. What you're going to need from us? I said, not much, just £2 million, and that's all. They gave me 2 million.
1.5.
Thank you. Yeah. And we started like really formally like that. So we said that, that we're going to do it as a conversation. Now, the sad thing in my, Greek brain, it was that, I would be in the same starting in the office and do it. Have you already watched Between Two Ferns? So it's exactly like this, he does this, it's like stand-up comedy, but not really, it's like comedy show, really informal. And I was like, we're going to do it like that, and we're just going to be sitting, across each other, having a completely informal discussion. But then we're like, oops, pandemic, if you go, although, we see each other every day because we work together, if you go out right now and show to people that you're sitting in the same office with one person, especially not keeping the distance,
you might get cancelled.
It's going to be really bad. It's going to be really bad. And it's not only about being politically correct, it's that you're giving also, the right impression about what can happen during the pandemic, right? So we said, okay, no, we're going to do it as a webcast. So you're going to be in your office, I'm going to be in my office, and then we're going to have this discussion. Then we invited several other experts from different parts, over the world, but also parts of research. And so initially it was 5 sessions ending with philosophy and ethics of the pandemic. It was really beautiful. And it was called Psychiatry of Pandemics. And then it was like really well received. And I was like, let's not stop. And people was like, well, what's next? I said, and this is how Braincast was born. And now it happens, every Monday from 1 to 1:30 live. And then people can access, all the, the previous webcasts and Braincast, in our archive. It is really diverse. It has everyone from students to postgrad to professors, big names. On the 27th, I have Shabaka Hutchins, one of my favorite, one of the biggest jazz musicians right now. We're going to talk about music and the brain. So it's really diverse.
Yeah, that's great. I think that now everyone, so that people in different professions are in a position to take charge of the public conversation that happens around the area of expertise in a way that, wasn't the case. If we were sitting here in 1995 and we wanted a widely accessible conversation about psychiatry, we'd have to hope that BBC News would humor us and give us the airtime.
Yeah.
And if they did, they might give us 30 seconds or like 2 minutes or something. And it's a bit like, okay, here's 2 minutes. You're for antidepressants, you're against antidepressants, and you just have to kind of like fight it out. And that's to the extent. But now, obviously, this is totally democratized, and we're in an incredibly beautiful position where we can have sort of in-depth conversations, and we, as psychiatrists, we can represent the complexity and the nuances of the topics which are important to us appropriately. And I think that's what's amazing about this ability to have these online conversations.
I mean, this is one of the good things about the pandemic, that it just surpassed the usual bureaucratic constipation of establishing something new. And that was, okay, maybe the only beautiful thing about the pandemic, because it came with loads of sadness and grief and pain. But at least, we have some novel things happening, which otherwise, I'm telling you, you would have taken age. And myself, I faced so many obstacles trying to implement new things. With the pandemic, yes, let's do it. So that's beautiful,
Yeah. We're now in a position, I think, where much like we're starting to see the economic fallout of the pandemic, I think we're now starting to see the psychiatric fallout. What have you observed so far, and what do you think both clinicians or members of the public should know, just how this affects us in terms of our mental health?
Yeah, that's, well, I'm only going to give you, what I observed and what I experienced. I'm not going to talk, about, really well-cited, papers that they've already talked about that. Because, they're all out there, people can just, if you just Google, pandemic and mental health, you're going to have like really good papers. Not all of them, I have to say. In JAMA, in Lancet Psychiatry, even, NEJM, so New England Journal of Medicine, they publish some good stuff. It's interesting to note, though, that, how easier some of these papers were published early on. So this was an attempt of the journals to stay, up to date with what was happening, but this ended up having to lower some of the standards. You're reading papers on NEJM that there was no way they're going to be published, normally otherwise. Anyway, but that's a whole different conversation again. But I think that gradually they're going back to the previous standards. But what I experienced in terms of mental health, people were not reaching out, and this is something really important that people have to keep in mind. When we hear that NHS survived, this is wrong. NHS survived because we took a step back. And the hospitals were not running in full gear. They were running in full gear and full throttle, but just for the pandemic.
So you mean both? So you mean there was a step back both in terms of psychiatry and medicine that's non-pandemic?
Yes, of course. Yes, the emergency department was empty. The amount of referrals that we were getting, actually, because we are doing this study right now, is around half. Which shows you that people, trying to follow, the government's advice, don't leave your house. Most of them, they were suffering indoors, and they wouldn't seek help as, let's say, easy as they would seek otherwise. I don't know if that makes sense. So let's say, for example,
yes. The threshold was higher.
Exactly. So this was the first thing, and obviously I'm talking because I work in a general hospital, so that was like really, really obvious and evident. Now, the people that were in the hospital for whatever reason, so the patients that were here, we've noticed higher rates of delirium, which is also reflected in the recent publications as well. Now we're experiencing and we're noticing the mental health impact of long ICU stays. So people that managed to survive the COVID, we are experiencing now, anxiety, adjustment reactions. I'm not saying that everyone's going to have PTSD or something like that. This is a question that we maybe be able to answer way later. Although from previous coronavirus outbreak, PTSD is not that a massive of a concern. But I can see that people will need way more psychological support right now. I'm talking, again, as I'm saying, I'm talking about the people that I'm seeing here. I'm not talking about people that see you, for example, in the home treatment team, or people that deal with community mental health teams. They may have a completely different picture of what's happening, right?
Yeah, what we're seeing in community teams primarily is the effects of isolation. And we're seeing people who have been isolated for 3 months, and we're seeing so many relapses of, particularly, I would say, depression and new onset depression.
And all these people that are going to come back here, I'm pretty confident that we're going to see, I can already see, a raise in the amount of referrals we receive, and a rise. But I'm pretty sure that we're going to see a tsunami. And that approaches our shores, and not only mental health, talking about all specialties, all medical specialties, as the elective admission are going to be, coming back and all that. But let's see. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and of course, if the economy takes a downturn, that will cause a positive or negative feedback loop and make things even worse, probably.
That's a whole different thing. That's a whole different matter. It's interesting. Before I forget, I remember, because I was also seeing outpatients, on the virtual realm. So I would have my virtual clinics, and the way that the pandemic affected some people, the way that the lockdown affected some people, it's unbelievable. And some things that I wouldn't even think about. I had a patient that clearly, she was telling me that her main worry was not the virus itself, but the inability to go outside of your house, and the worry that I'm not going to be able to go to the off license on time to get the amount of food that I need. It brought back memories of her traumatic experiences when her husband left her out of the blue with her newborn baby, took all of her money and left her bankrupt. And she started reliving these experiences of, I'm not going to be able to have food, I'm not going to be able to provide for my daughter. Her daughter now obviously, is way older, but still, I would never think of it like that. But it's only through the interaction and talking with more and more people that you see that, the lockdown has, it affected people in ways that we wouldn't even think about.
Yeah, I think just the social isolation alone, it's really important for people to remember that we're the most social primates, right?
Yeah.
So for us to be on our own is really a deprivation of some of our most basic needs. And then the restrictions of freedoms on top of that.
Yeah.
The freedom to go out as one chooses, and even just that tightening around sort of getting essential items must have made people feel very, very frightened. And the people who were in our society, what's now being called the precariat, the people who were just about handling things, of course, now are shifted into this totally vulnerable position.
The one thing is that, we should also not forget about, the impact this had on us, because, we are part of the society. Most of the times, we take the doctor role and we only talk about the patients, forgetting that, if we are not well, we also cannot, look after our patients. We can also not do our I don't like to call what I'm doing a job, but it is a job anyway, to do our job the right way.
Yeah, it's true. There's a lot of criticism of self-improvement, that it's quite self-centered and maybe even narcissistic. And I think you can make a case for that. But like you're saying, you need to help other people, you need to be okay yourself. And if you can be okay yourself, then the amount of people you can potentially help is enormous.
Yeah.
But you can't do it if you're in a constant state of deprivation.
Of course. We had, because here at King's, we established some really, really, really beautiful interventions and programs to support all, the healthcare professionals, in the hospital, and not only healthcare professionals, everyone, every member of staff in the hospital. And, the worries that people had, they were real. They were real. Just thinking, people saying, how do I go back to my family after a day in the hospital? So what would happen if I carry the virus from my day job to my house, where is my husband? You may have all the relatives, your children. So of course, so this plays up in your mind. Anyway, okay, which I'm changing subject. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. I think I'm conscious of your time, but to wrap up, I always let my guests ask me a question if they happen to have any questions for me, or if some occur in the moment.
A question for you. Wow. What would I ask you? Do you want it to be relevant to the pandemic or irrelevant to the pandemic?
Let's go for irrelevant.
Irrelevant. Okay. So maybe I will ask you, since you are doing something similar to Braincast, because I'm doing it on the webcast side, and you're doing podcasts, for some time now. How do you feel? Because this is some reflecting on how I feel as an immigrant, using my second language to do something that is actually based so heavily on language. How do you feel about that? How do you feel about, are you conscious of, the way you use the language, the way you come across, your accent? Because all these things, play up in my mind, especially, when I was doing radio in Greek, perfectly fine. Yeah, I can talk for hours. But now I'm so much more conscious about, am I using the right words? Or, do people understand me, when I'm talking? And funnily enough, I had a radio show in English that was called Bad Accent, for obvious reasons. So how do you feel about doing that?
Well, I'm lucky because in Malta, I was raised with actually English being my primary language, which is kind of a remnant. Malta was a British colony until the 60s. And was very encouraged that I would speak English. I actually did a recording with a psychotherapist from Ghana last week, and we had that in common, and that English was kind of prioritized because it's an international language that opens up so many doors. But to answer your question, I'm very self-conscious about how I speak, even though I feel comfortable speaking in English.
Yeah.
Speaking regularly in public like this for the first time, I'm wary because I'm conscious that one carries a lot of responsibility.
Yeah.
You know, we're doing this under the guise of being health professionals, and the ethos of the podcast is very much about disseminating valuable information.
Yeah.
Primarily, and maybe number two is doing so in a way that fairly appreciates complexity and nuance that isn't sort of black and white. So I probably think about it more than I should.
Well, to be honest, I mean, you have way better accent than I do. But what about the political correctness? Does it bother you?
Yes and no. I think I am very careful because I want to, number one, speak in a way which I think is accurate to my understanding, that's concordant to my understanding of a situation.
Yep.
But number two, I don't feel any desire to be a party of any kind of unnecessary hatred or offense, bigotry. And so I think one has to walk this fine line. And I think every situation invites you to say, what's the right balance in this situation, in this conversation? What's the right balance in that conversation?
Yeah.
And I think embracing both of those in these very polarized times is important, because another thing that I think is important to me is trying in whatever small way I can to ameliorate division and increase cohesion, because it's one of the problems of our times, I feel. What do you think about it?
No, it is a really fine line. I'm asking about that because, you know, it's a huge topic and something that has been bothering me for many years. You know, about how people can just get obsessed with something that someone said sometime, whatever. And yeah, and especially nowadays. I mean, I don't know if if you follow the whole outbreak with the Vogue Portugal. So Vogue Portugal, you know, did this editorial. I think it's this month. So I just read it about a few days ago. With, you know, the first page actually depicting, for some people in a completely inappropriate way, mental health matters. Actually, they named the whole issue a madness.
Right.
It obviously, you know, made many people and some of them justifiably so, really angry about how the whole matter of mental health, you know, was depicted in Vogue. But on the other hand, because, you know, for various reasons, you're going to have many friends that are into arts, and it's so interesting to see how the different approach they have to that, and how more open they are and to accepting things that may be insulting and offending to other people. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, right? Okay. But they were way more open. They would say, yes, maybe they didn't do it in the best way possible, but at the end of the day, it's art. It's the way that someone expresses themselves. It's a fascinating discussion, obviously, and not something that I'm hoping that we're going to cover now. But
I mean, here's one problem. One problem with political correctness is that you're never going to truly confront and address a complex problem without coming across some offensive material in the process.
Of course, yeah.
And that's because life is difficult and dark and full of suffering. We're not on a positive note, but that's true, unfortunately. And so you to delve into that earnestly is to risk offending people, I think.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that there aren't people who aren't deliberately offending people because of their own issues. I think that happens.
That's different.
Also.
Yeah, I agree. That's different. That's being pure mean person. That's different. But
exactly.
It's the intent.
It's the intent.
And usually, not many people actually ask, so why did you say that? What was your intent? And I think that, you know, people would be surprised to hear that, you know, the intent of most people, okay, not everyone, is definitely not to offend or insult. My grandfather had one leg, right? And every time I would see him, I would make fun of him and start limping. Did I want to offend him and insult? He was laughing. Because he knew that I was a child and I was just having fun. But at the same time, he would have been well offended, right? Anyway.
Yeah, my grandfather suffered a serious head injury, neck injury actually, a couple of years ago. He's fine now, thankfully. But
that's good.
At the time, he had a CT brain, which showed that his brain was unremarkable. And so my family and I just relentlessly made fun of him in the A&E department about how unremarkable his brain was. Offensive, possibly offensive humor like that is an amazing mechanism that we have for healing, actually, and for catharsis. So that's one thing I might throw in there. Well, Pospo, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for coming. You're welcome back anytime.
Thanks for the invitation, man. You really enjoyed it. Hopefully, I didn't talk too off the beaten track. It's sometimes it's hard to
off the beaten track is what we specialize in.
This is a Maudsley Learning Podcast. Thanks for listening.
You are listening to the Thinking Mind Podcast.
If you enjoyed today's podcast, we'd love it if you share it with a friend, or you could give us a rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. If you fancy it, you can even buy us a coffee to support the team, and the links for that will be in the show notes. Thanks for listening.